Are the BRICS nations issuing a new reserve currency? And if so, how is it going to work? Stay tuned while we break it down for you. Welcome to the show. This is Molly Elmore with Hummingbird, and today we're going to talk about reserve currencies again, one of my favorite topics. Today specifically, the BRICS nations and their plans to issue a reserve currency. All right, let's get a little background here. The BRICS nations are Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, and they have formed a coalition or an alliance that primarily centers around trade. These are all countries that export various commodities, and obviously they import them as well because their citizens need stuff. And since 1944, everybody has been trading using dollars as a payment and settlement currency, and this isn't always the best deal for everybody involved. It actually doesn't even benefit the United States tremendously, but we'll talk about that in a little bit. The reality is that a lot of nations have expressed interest to trade outside of dollars, and since the Saudi agreement in the U.S. with the U.S. in the 1970s, nobody has bought major goods, specifically oil, with a currency other than dollars. And that kind of creates problems for nations because the U.S. government can sanction a country that they don't agree with politically and seize their assets, which has happened to both Afghanistan and the Russia earlier in 2022. And if you are a central bank in the world and you're storing your nation's wealth in an asset like dollars, U.S. treasuries, and the U.S. government seizes those, that's a big problem. So countries have expressed interest in trading outside the dollar. In addition, and I get this, I'm American, so I, like to see American initiatives succeed, but it's not really a fair system because the U.S. government with the Fed can essentially print as much U.S. dollars as they want, which means that you can buy as many commodities and resources from the global market kind of for free. If you can print the money, there really isn't a hard cost to resources that you buy. Now, I don't necessarily think that they print money in every case, but that's a pretty powerful privilege to have, to be the one who gets to print the money. Now, because dollars are used for trade, no other nation can print dollars out of nothing like the U.S. Fed relationship can. So a country like Russia or China has to actually use energy, resources, labor, etc. to pay for resources on the global supply chain. So it's not really that fair. And I can see why that is frustrating. And most countries are also paying for things using debt model. They borrow the money essentially to finance these things. And with high interest rates and a very strong dollar, that has gotten really expensive for a lot of nations. Now, the interest rate increases are fairly new, but the dollar's been strong for a while. And that is rough on kind of a smaller emerging market that has a weaker currency relative to the dollar. It just means that when you exchange your currency for dollars, you have to give a lot. You have to exchange a lot to get a fairly modest amount of stuff. So bunch of reasons why it is not really in the interest of a lot of nations to continually trade in dollars. But there's been a lot of resistance. Countries that have tried to do this have faced serious consequences in the past. So if it were to happen, it looks like it's got to be an alliance of some pretty big players to overcome the resistance. So the BRICS nations formed an alliance, and I did a separate video, I'll put that in the description, on the sort of backstory on BRICS and sort of what their plans are. This video is specifically devoted to some details around how their reserve currency is expected to work. Now, this is speculative. It's not a done deal. They could change their plans. My research is based on what has been kind of publicly released, either by the BRICS Alliance themselves at sort of trade show, industry event kind of things, or from people who are insiders and kind of know how this type of thing works. But I wanted to just break down how a basket currency works and why this BRICS basket currency is different than some that we've seen elsewhere. So a basket currency essentially is a set of resources that are sort of pooled together. It's not just one thing. So the US dollar is a reserve currency. It's an asset, and it's one currency. Well, let's say that the US dollar was something was wrong with it. It was unstable, or there was some reason why you didn't want to trade exclusively in that. You could take a bunch of currencies, like maybe the Canadian dollar and the Mexican peso. You could take the whole North American currencies and kind of pool them together, kind of a little bit like a mutual fund where they have like a weighted contribution, and you could issue a new currency where you're using those national currencies, those sovereign currencies, as kind of like the collateral on the new one. If you're familiar with crypto at all, you could have an asset that you then mint a new token based on the original asset. That's kind of this idea of tokenization. So the basket currency idea has been around for a while. When the US dollar was named the global reserve currency after the Bretton Woods Agreement in 1944, there was another consideration, or another proposal considered, called the Bancor, which was a basket currency based on several of the currencies from the nations that were kind of part of the Bretton Woods group, basically like the G7 type countries. That wasn't picked, so the US dollar was selected, but years later, the IMF created a basket currency called the SDR, which again, it's a weighted average of the member currencies, and it can be used as a reserve currency for trade. Now, regular citizens like us, we don't use reserve currencies. Like if you got some SDR, like you wouldn't be able to spend it anywhere. It's like the banks have like a private network where they can trade and settle up for their payments from bank to bank, and these reserve assets are used kind of in the interbanking world. It's almost like they're on a private blockchain and they can do their own thing, and we don't have access to that. So this BRICS currency is going to be a basket currency, and it's going to include currencies from the members, just similar to the SDR, but it has this interesting additional layer, and that the member currencies will also, the members will also be able to leverage assets like gold and silver and oil and even some kind of food commodities. And the idea, from my understanding, is that it's kind of like going to a casino. So let's say you went to a casino and you had a bunch of money in your wallet, a bunch of cash. And you go up to the casino counter and you take all the cash out of your wallet, and you give it to them, and then they give you a set of poker chips, basically, that correspond to the value of the cash that you gave them. So they're kind of like a placeholder, a proxy, sort of. I don't know if these are perfect analogies, but they're sort of a representation of the value of the cash. And you go then to the casino and you play the games and whatever. And then when you're done, you take those poker chips and you could cash them back out for cash. Hopefully you have more than when you arrived. So in this BRICS asset currency scenario, let's say a country showed up and they had a pile of gold and they had a bunch of oil and some cash and some diamonds. There's a list of 20 different assets. I haven't seen the full list, so I'm speculating on some of them, like whether diamonds would be included. But let's say you had all these things that have perceived wealth, value, and you have this big pile of them, and then let's say, it's worth like $1 billion, and you then would get a corresponding amount of this BRICS reserve asset. It's probably going to be a digital token. So they're going to mint a token and give it to these BRICS countries to represent the value of these assets. So this is a very, very different idea than SDR, in my opinion, because we are now tokenizing assets that are resources. So gold is a great example. We've seen a movement to tokenize gold. You can look at Kinesis or Pax Gold token, or even, I bet you some Glint is going to probably do this kind of thing, where you have this physical asset that has a high perceived value that generally people store, and now we're going to allow you to use that value in some kind of trade and commerce. Now, this interesting thing with BRICS is now you're going to be using commodities that are potentially consumed, like oil and food. I even saw one article that mentioned like water could be one of these. I don't know how that would work, but it's kind of moving towards this idea that I don't know if I've heard about, maybe you have too, that everything will be tokenized, and that includes like natural resources. There is a event, I think in Egypt, called the COP something, this sort of like Davos type meeting about climate change related things. And one thing I have heard is on the agenda is to talk about tokenization of resources. And I will do another video to break that down. But this is something that has come up quite a few times. It's not just in this context. That imagine if all the resources in the world were tokenized and available for allocation, there would be good and bad things, in my estimation. Good, because it would now give countries a way to finance their trade without having to use debt. So our whole monetary system is based on debt, based on borrowing. Every time you borrow, you got to pay interest, unless you're getting some kind of zero interest rate, which is not an option right now. And this creates sort of debt slavery type situations, and it can lead to defaults. Like there's a lot of problems with doing everything based on a debt model. But what would be a better alternative? Like if you, let's just say you hypothetically canceled all the debt, our money is based on debt. Like money's created when debt is issued. So how would you have new money? Like how would you start over? Well, what if you took all the resources in the world, every single one of them, you gave them some kind of valuation, and then you issued a new currency that was based on the value of those assets? It's exactly what it sounds like the BRICS nations are going to do with this reserve currency. Now, I don't think that individual citizens who live in a BRICS nation would use this currency. It's probably like the SDR in that it's sort of a bank-to-bank thing. The banks would be on a private network. They would use this to settle up trade. And then if you were in China, for example, you were buying stuff, you would use Chinese currency. They have a CBDC there now. And this reserve currency thing isn't really something that would affect retail people like us. But it does contribute to this bigger idea of like, what if you are a regular citizen and you own assets? Let's say you own land or you own gold. Will we be given the opportunity to turn those into blockchain-based money? I don't have the answer to all that yet, but this BRICS reserve currency concept really does highlight that that is the direction that we're moving in, away from this debt-based monetary system to something that is based on assets. Now, people like to use this label, and I certainly do too, about are we going back to gold-backed currency and like asset-backed currency? I'm not sure if that's the best label, because there's some things that I'm not clear about, which is, let's say you're a BRICS nation and you have a bunch of oil and you use this to get issued the currency, but then you can you use that oil? Do you sell it? Like what happens to the currency then if you need to use that oil, and who's keeping track of whether or not you've used it? So I don't know if this is just for like the minting phase where like the new currency comes out and it becomes part of barter system, trade system, or whether you are expected to keep this allocation of asset somehow safe and not spend it. Because that was kind of the problem that happened with fiat, with the US dollar back in the 70s and late 60s, was there was supposed to be a one-to-one, like gold for dollars, but nobody was really keeping track of it. It was sort of a secret where the gold was. And so the US government, which is very tempting to do, they spent more money than they actually had gold in reserves, and that ended up kind of collapsing the whole gold system. And back then, citizens couldn't trade gold for dollars. Like it was actually illegal in the United States to own gold, which is so crazy to imagine. So it was still kind of a bank-to-bank thing. So I still have a lot of questions about what happens if member countries, use these resources to the tokens that are issued for this reserve currency. But I will do my best to uncover those details. But in the meantime, it does look like this is the direction that we are going, that the BRICS nations will have a different currency for which to trade with. And I don't think it's like going to prevent these countries from trading with other countries. So, let's say you're a BRICS nation and you're storing your wealth in this new reserve currency and you want to trade with Mexico. I don't see any reason why you couldn't use something like Ripple's ODL to swap your BRICS currency for whatever currency that Mexican banks are using, whether they have their own sovereign currency, or maybe North America will create their own reserve currency. I don't know. Like, we'll see what happens. And Mexico can't use the BRICS currency, and BRICS can't use the North American currency. So what do you do in that situation? You go to something like Ripple's ODL, where you swap for this neutral token, like XRP, and you then use that neutral bridge currency to support this transaction. So it's sort of perfect use case, I think, for when you have a bunch of these sort of walled gardens like BRICS. Let's say the IMF does one. I don't know, Africa might do one. Who knows, like how many regions there would be. And if they don't want to accept each other's currency, no worries. You go to this sort of centralized pool where all the currencies are available, and you swap yours for the placeholder bridge currency, and then whoever you're selling to can swap for what they need. So that is how I see kind of the Ripple ODL model fitting into this. Does that mean that everybody has to use Ripple? Not necessarily. I think the good thing about that software platform is it's been tested for a long time, and they have a lot of relationships with banks. And I've not heard one thing about that software not working or being hacked or having any type of performance issues at all. So it seems like the best system for this purpose. But that doesn't necessarily mean it will be the only one that people ever use forever. All right, that's my breakdown on the BRICS reserve currency and what a basket currency means, and that this is a step in the direction of the tokenization of everything. And if you like this type of stuff, feel free to subscribe to the channel. Please like this video. It actually helps me out a lot. And join me in my locals community, twostepsahead.locals.com, and we'll continue the conversation over there. Alrighty, I will see you in the next video.